So I suppose I should get started. I don't know if I'm going to speak for 45 minutes straight, but just in case, I should probably get started earlier rather than later. Hi, everybody. I'm R. Tyler Croy. I'm going to talk about Evergreen, which is a project that my team and I have been working on for most of this year that I hope you heard about in the keynote yesterday. The way that I'm going to do this is a little bit different than I would typically do a presentation, in that I'm going to start with the demo. I want everybody to sort of see what I see in Evergreen and why this is such a promising project for me. So this also rewards people who show up on time for their talks. So I've decided I wasn't going to do a demo in production because that's always a terrible idea. So I'm running a Jenkins Evergreen environment locally that I'll be working with here. And in its sort of most basic form, Evergreen is a distribution of the Jenkins you already know and love with some of the best, I would say, defaults already configured out of the box. And so this is my Jenkins Evergreen instance. This is just a normal Blue Ocean interface, nothing special, normal pipelines, all sorts of stuff configured out of the box in my Jenkins Evergreen installation. I've got a demo pipeline here that I'm just going to run, and we'll let that start and spin up while I go ahead and talk. And what's really powerful about Evergreen and this automatically updating model for Jenkins is that we can improve Jenkins automatically from the Jenkins project standpoint. So if you'll indulge some of my terminal messiness here. I've got a Jenkins Evergreen instance running along with the backend services that are necessary running in this environment. Up here in the top left, my logs are set to debug, just to make sure if anything goes wrong, I can debug the demo right in front of y'all. I'm going to go ahead and spin up another instance, just so we have a couple of instances communicating with the Evergreen backend. I also want to make sure that I use as much compute and memory as possible. I know that always makes the demos fun. But at the sort of most basic level, Evergreen contains a distribution manifest, which sort of describes what goes into that Evergreen instance. And that includes Jenkins core, that includes configuration, and we're using the configuration as code plugin, and by the end of this conference, I hope everybody in here is also using that. But it also includes plugins that provide a very important, I would say, user experience for most users. I don't think I have JQ installed on here, but we'll just look at one of the, this is inside Evergreen. This is going on. None of you should ever really care about this, but we basically have a big, long list of plugins that we're going to include in the Evergreen distribution for this demo. Oh, my pipeline passed. That's always fun. So let me just go back to the home page. And if you can imagine sort of the future for the Jenkins project, we've been iterating a lot over the past couple of years, and we have this challenge where users aren't getting the updates. They're just not made aware that they might be running an older version of Jenkins internally. They haven't seen Jenkins pipeline. Nobody wants to run an upgrade, or the person who used to manage that Jenkins environment has disappeared, and so it just sort of trails off into the distance and becomes one of those Jenkins steins that Sasha was talking about yesterday. With Evergreen, we can improve Jenkins for you, which to me is super cool for a lot of people. So I'm going to just imagine we've created a new functionality, and in this case, there's another plugin that is in the experimental update center, which is some really behind-the-scenes stuff in the Jenkins project that augments Blue Ocean. And I'm going to go ahead and publish a new update for Jenkins Evergreen. And so you'll notice in these other two terminals, stuff is starting to happen. And so if I go to my Jenkins instance, Jenkins actually just received the update. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner for y'all, we lost the connection in Blue Ocean, which means Jenkins has been restarting. And so the update was applied. We snapshotted the configuration on disk. We applied the update and restarted Jenkins. And once the health checks passed to tell us that that Jenkins environment is safe, then we restart it. And because I decided to run a whole bunch of Jenkins instances, they're slowly coming online. And then once Jenkins is back online, the connection comes back, Blue Ocean reloads, and what you'll see is a new functionality that didn't previously exist in Blue Ocean. And that functionality, in this case for this demo, is this Executors tab. This is a new plugin that's in the Experimental Update Center that hasn't been released. It's not part of Blue Ocean, but because we can sort of curate this distribution, all of a sudden, every Jenkins Evergreen instance now has this new feature that they can take advantage of. And it's kind of basic. It's really more of a nice little demo. But sometimes that's not going to work out so great. Sometimes, everybody that's shipping software understands that sometimes mistakes are made. And the beautiful thing about Evergreen compared to our traditional release model is we can recover from that and remove the broken either plugin or remove the broken configuration and ship that update out to users automatically. So I'm going to go ahead and this is what we would be doing behind the scenes in the Jenkins project. We say, oh wait, that plugin was actually, we saw a lot of errors that were reported from Evergreen instances, so we need to roll that back. And so when we ship the new set of, the new update for Evergreen, all of the Jenkins Evergreen instances will receive that rolled back update. I mean, it's really a roll forward. Apply the change, restart Jenkins, snapshot, restart Jenkins, make sure that health checks are all passing, snapshot again, and then Jenkins will be coming back online as soon as those JVMs kick on. And what you'll notice is that this executors link up here in the top center will no longer be there. In this sort of example, just imagine we determined it was causing a lot of problems for users, so we would want to remove it to make sure that everybody was having a good experience. Reload, 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 and it's gone. And so this model that we have with Jenkins Evergreen allows us to roll out security updates. It allows us to roll out new features to where if you want Jenkins to just be there to be running your pipelines, you don't want to babysit Jenkins, you don't want to be the Jenkins expert. Evergreen gives you a path forward to have the latest and greatest from the Jenkins project without having to become that Jenkins expert inside of your organization. So that's what Jenkins Evergreen is today, and there's a lot that I'm going to talk about on where we're going with this. That's really exciting. But I want to take a step back since I started with the demo and sort of explain sort of how I came here and why I'm so passionate about Evergreen. So I've been working on the Jenkins project since before it was called the Jenkins project. Old-timers might remember what it used to be called. But I've run Jenkins for the Jenkins project for a very, very long time. At every company that I've ever worked for, I've been that person that sets up Jenkins and babysits it and makes sure that Jenkins is working really, really well. And personally, I feel like I could set up a really, really good Jenkins, and it would take me an hour or 2 hours to really tweak everything, get all the configuration, all the right plugins, get everything nice and integrated. But that's not everybody, and I think most people don't want to spend that amount of time to get the really ideal experience from Jenkins. And so when we started to talk about what could we do to improve some of what we have in the Jenkins project, I wanted to sort of take what I knew Jenkins could be. If you configured, you turned the right knobs, if you added the right plugins, added the right configuration, and make that a package that everybody could enjoy. I wanted everybody to experience the Jenkins that I know and the Jenkins that I love without having to go through all of the pain and suffering to get that. So Evergreen is sort of, it started at this event last year with this challenge from Kosuke that we had talked about in the Contributor Summit. I'll go ahead and maximize my slides. We challenged ourselves as a project to say, we want to get to a point where every user that tries out Jenkins can understand what makes Jenkins so powerful with all of the latest things that we've done, all of the innovation that's occurred in the project over the last few years in under 5 minutes. And as we started to talk about this, it became very clear that the way that Jenkins is currently distributed is very, very flexible for a lot of people, but there's just too many options. And that's what led to Evergreen. But inside of Jenkins, to begin with, we already have all of the building blocks that make Jenkins, for me, an incredibly powerful piece of technology. You just have to sort of know where to get them. And that includes the pipeline, which if you've used Jenkins from before pipeline, for me, it's like night and day. I will never go back from pipeline. It's everything that we do in Jenkins for the Jenkins project is only pipeline now. So all of our projects that use Jenkins for building plugins, testing distributions, that's all now done in pipeline because it's just such a great tool. And Blue Ocean comes into that, and secure defaults, and all of these changes that we've made have actually been around for a couple years. But a lot of people either aren't updating or aren't made aware of some of these great improvements that are actually already in Jenkins. And so for Evergreen, we sort of set out with 4 pillars, and these are described in a design document called JEP 300, where we sort of outline, here's what Evergreen should really be. And for users, what Evergreen really should be is the batteries should be included. You should be able to grab Evergreen, and all of those great things that are already present in the Jenkins project are there and ready for you to use. And we wanted to take it one step further in that we wanted to auto-configure it. So out of the box, in my demo, I didn't really call this out much. We're using the Docker flavor of Evergreen, which comes out of the box configured with Docker support to run agents as Docker containers, all out of the box and configured with configuration as code, which means when you start with the Docker flavor of Evergreen, it's already set up to run things that are necessary for Docker. And I hope you don't mind if I call you out, Joe. Joe, who's stopped by the Contributor Summit on Monday, we started talking about what we could do on AWS, because we've been looking at making the AWS flavor one of the things that we support. And what we can do there is we can auto-configure the EC2 plugin, for example, or auto-configure integrating with ECS, or auto-configure pushing artifacts into S3 buckets automatically. And that's another major component for me of what makes Evergreen special, is that we know what are the appropriate defaults for most use cases, and we can just ship them as part of Evergreen and put those inside the box. Another big aspect of Evergreen that we have started to work on, but we haven't really been able to spend a lot of time on yet, is we've been bundling a user guide, a very, very small user guide thus far, with Evergreen by default. So as Evergreen progresses, you're going to start to see more and more user documentation inside of that Jenkins instance automatically as part of the distribution. And I think that's an important sea change for how the Jenkins project has typically viewed our documentation and education responsibilities to users. And so with Evergreen, we consider that one of the major aspects that we need to include in the distribution. And all of that sort of comes together to help the user go from, I downloaded this thing, I want to run my pipelines as quickly as possible. And that's sort of the big overarching goal that we have here. For Jenkins developers on the backside of this, Evergreen also gives us a lot of power tools that we didn't previously have. Because we're distributing a core plugins and configuration that's deterministic and is tracked through our own continuous delivery process, we actually can run a significant amount of testing and smoke testing before those updates ever reach an Evergreen instance. And so yes, we are going to be running all of these tests and making sure that that's a really solid distribution for all of you all. We actually added one more thing with the expectation that sometimes that's not going to work. If you've ever gone through a continuous delivery process, you have to sort of plan for failure at some point. And so we also made sure that Jenkins Evergreen is connected and will report errors back to us when something goes wrong. So on the left side of our continuous delivery process, we've got a significant amount of testing where we know exactly what we're shipping to users has been tested through our test cases. On the right side of that continuous delivery process, we also have the feedback from those instances to tell us how successful we've been. And that is information that as a project we've actually never really had before. We've had to wait for developers or systems administrators or operators to download updates, try them out, determine that there is something wrong, and if we're really, really lucky, they would go to our Jira and report an issue or go to a mailing list and say, hey, something's wrong. And that's really great, and I'm thankful for all of you that have actually taken the time to report bugs, but I believe we can do so much better. And as I would say, developers in the Jenkins project, but as CD practitioners across the industry, think about how we do things better, being able to fail safely is a huge part of that, and being able to learn from those mistakes is a huge part of what a good continuous delivery process is. And finally, with Evergreen, I think we can eat some of our own dog food in the Jenkins project. And so from an overall distribution standpoint, because we're sort of taking, I don't want to be too flippant about this, but all of the, for me, the really good parts of what makes Jenkins great in 2018, we can just bundle those out of the box. So we actually have configuration as code out of the box. So you can add your own configuration as code for Jenkins Evergreen. We have pipeline out of the box. We have Blue Ocean out of the box. GitHub support is all out of the box. And we took that one step further in that we actually actively remove legacy features that we know are going to provide a subpar user experience. But in Jenkins, the core distribution, we don't want to remove them just yet because of backwards compatibility discussions that we still have ongoing. In Evergreen, because we're starting a little bit fresh, we know that there's a better way to do things in 2018, and we're going to start from that point without carrying forward some of the legacy that Jenkins has accumulated over the past decade of its development. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about automatic upgrades because these are, to me, this is probably the most important part of what makes Evergreen powerful is the automatic upgrades. And for a lot of people, it might be the scariest part. And so I want to tell you about two types of Jenkins instances that I've seen over the last decade in the project. The one on the left, that is your left, yeah. The one on the left is what we use, or how we manage our own Jenkins infrastructure for the Jenkins project. We use configuration, infrastructure as code. We use Puppet in the Jenkins project. We use Docker. We manage this sort of deployment lifecycle like Jenkins is this production service, because for the Jenkins project, it really is. And most larger organizations, I think, fall into this bucket, where they want to track and manage their delivery of Jenkins the same way they might manage their own production applications. And then there's this other type of Jenkins that we also see a tremendous amount of that Sasha mentioned can become the sort of Jenkinstein. And that's the Jenkins that someone set up under a desk where someone didn't really care that it was Jenkins. They wanted something that was going to build and test their projects and didn't have the time or desire to spend a lot of time thinking about what goes into Jenkins, what could we be doing better with Jenkins, or how should we be using this for our project. They just found some really good tool on the internet, downloaded it, set it up, and went back to doing what they wanted to do. And this latter is the Jenkins instance that I really envision Evergreen is going to change tremendously. And the reason that I think that this sort of second instance is the ideal use case for this automatic upgrade process is because we're seeing across the industry over-the-air updates and automatic updates from vendors becoming more and more common, is everybody is recognizing that continuous delivery for applications that are either a car or an Internet of Things device is really, really important. And so we take inspiration from Tesla, what they've done, Nest, before and after they were acquired by Google. They will ship updates to their software. And even Microsoft, I'm really impressed with the effort that Microsoft has put into shipping Windows in this sort of, I know it came first, but it is the Evergreen model is more or less how Windows 10 is shipping. And that's really powerful for that long tail of users that just want Windows to work or just want their car to work and want new features and want security updates, but don't want to become experts in managing all of that. And there's another reason to go down this automatic upgrade path, and that is if we don't, that Jenkins as an appliance sort of instance becomes a problem for the Internet of Things and the security industry at large. And one of the examples that I actually really, really like to point out, because it's so incredibly devastating how big this attack on this router OS vulnerability has been, these routers that have no facility to be updated are being turned into enormous botnets and being used for a launching point for other attacks against users. And unfortunately for, I think it's Microtech is the company that created this, they don't have this ability to push updates, even the most critical security fixes. So we have this vulnerability that became a huge issue on the entire internet that's being used to compromise users and to launch additional attacks. And a little bit of that automatic upgrade model would have gone a long way to prevent this from spreading like wildfire the way that it has. And unfortunately, in the Jenkins project, this is not an abstract concept. There's this news story was talked about earlier this year, and what is incredibly frustrating for me as a Jenkins contributor is the exploit that's being used was fixed 18 months ago. So 18 months ago, we fixed this issue, but there's this Jenkins appliance, Jenkins as an appliance cohort of users that just don't upgrade. And it's a risk for, I think, all of us on the internet to have services and Internet of Things devices that are floating around that just never get updated that can be used to launch further attacks. And for the Jenkins project, this is obviously bad press, but we have no way to like push updates to those users and get them uncompromised or prevent users that are running older instances from being compromised by these well-known vulnerabilities that were fixed, discovered like 18 months and 1 week ago, and were fixed 18 months ago and released 18 months ago, and widely publicized through our normal security advisory channels. But those users that are just running Jenkins under the desk, they don't think about it. They're not listening to our advisories or reading our blog posts because it's just an appliance. And that's where Jenkins Evergreen and the automatic upgrade process is, I think, really important to what we're doing. And I think we're going to see two paths for Jenkins as we move forward. There's a lot of organizations that just want Jenkins to run pipelines, just want that appliance. And then there's another cohort of organizations that want everything to be fully managed. And because we're using all of the same bits underneath, we can do both. And so Jenkins Evergreen, and I really hope that everybody understands this, Jenkins Evergreen does not replace what we're doing right now in the Jenkins project. It adds on to that. It's all of the same bits, it's all of the same configuration, but it's a different packaging and a different distribution mechanism to make sure that we can provide this great appliance-like or Jenkins as a service-like experience for users that just want Jenkins as a service. I should have gone forward one slide, that was my bad. And so when I've talked with people as we've been developing Evergreen, there's been this fear that I've encountered of automatic upgrades, you're going to break my Jenkins instances. And people are somehow, I think we've all gone through these terrible upgrades of not just Jenkins, but other pieces of software to where upgrades are a scary thing. And I fully acknowledge that that fear is there, and our challenge as contributors to the project is to make automatic as safe as possible, if not safer than running an upgrade yourself. And so I want to talk a little bit about the safety we've incorporated into Evergreen to make this possible. We're not just, shipping, saying YOLO and ship plugins down to Jenkins Evergreen instances. We've put a lot of work into making sure that we can apply these updates safely and that your data is safe as these updates roll through. And so like I mentioned, error reporting is automatic and it comes back to the Jenkins project. But we also have, we use Git underneath the hood to do snapshotting of configuration in that Jenkins home directory because there's a lot of things that are being stored on disk before we apply an update and after we apply an update. And if something goes wrong, when those health checks are being run after an applied update goes out, if something goes wrong, we do a git revert of that configuration in case that update mutated state on the disk and report back to the server to say, all right, we just received update level 15. And on this instance, update level 15 caused some problems. So we're going to say update level 15 is problematic. We went down to update level 14, which is our state from before. Our configuration was preserved at update level 14. And that information comes back to the Jenkins project. And then we can figure out what the problem was, fix it, and then ship update level 16. And when update level 16 is made available, that client goes from 14 to 16 because we know that 15 now has a problem. And later today, my colleague who's also been working with me on Evergreen, Baptiste, will be talking a little bit more about how this works under the covers from a technology standpoint. But suffice it to say, we've been designing from the get-go ways in which we can make these updates safe. And that's the most important thing, is safety in these updates. And I guarantee the large majority of that long tail of users, if they are applying updates, they aren't giving it near the level of consideration for safety of data and preservation of what they're doing that we are. which is why I think that automatic for those Jenkins as an appliance instances is going to be much safer than what a lot of people are actually doing today. Just want to make sure that I'm not speaking too fast. So as it stands right now, I would say that Evergreen is ready for early adopters. We aren't going to recommend anybody run Evergreen on what would be a production system for their organization right now. But if you go to Jenkins.io/projects, I'll go ahead and take that page up right now. Projects, Evergreen. If you go to Jenkins.io, we've got some details on how to get started with Jenkins Evergreen on Docker and how to sort of play around with it, what it looks like. And early adopters or people who are interested in the future of the project and where we could go with this, please try it out and let us know what's missing, because there might be some features in that distribution that are worth adding for everybody, because we started with an intentionally small set of features, or what we can do better, or maybe Docker isn't really what you want something that runs on AWS or Azure or a Kubernetes native sort of thing. We want to hear about that as well. We're also fairly active on Gitter, so you can join our chat and say like, hey, I tried this out and it broke, or hey, I tried this out and I really like it. How do I do this? Please just get involved. We're in that early adopter phase, so if you want to, I would say, influence where Evergreen is going as a project, now is probably the best time to get involved. Let me go back to the slides. But there's a lot of stuff that we already have planned that's coming up. And probably the most important part of what we're doing right now is just going through this exercise, just getting practiced at delivering software in this continuous delivery model, which the Jenkins project just isn't familiar with right now. So as I've been here working with some of the other contributors that are here at DevOps World Jenkins World, we've been introducing them into how errors get reported back to the project and how they can get access to those. Or if they've got a newer version of a plugin or newer version of something that they've been working on that they want to see released through the Evergreen distribution model, how they can get involved in that and how they can contribute. And so our cadence right now has been, we've been pushing a update probably once every 2 or 3 days. And that's usually, someone made some positive changes to the Git plugin. That's a really important thing in Evergreen. So we pushed out an update which just moved the Git plugin up to the latest version. And so we're going through this sort of practice of shipping Jenkins Evergreen regularly. And that's what we're focusing on quite a bit right now, is getting the Jenkins project, I would say, comfortable with this continuous delivery model and proving to the rest of the developers that are working on Jenkins why this is beneficial for them and how this is going to make their lives as maintainers of these plugins that much easier. And of course, there's some additional features that we've talked about that I want to incorporate. I'd say right now, Evergreen is at its first milestone. I wouldn't call it basic, but we focused on the bare bones features. But there's a lot of other really interesting things that I want to implement that will make lives for users that much easier. One of the things that we've talked about with the Jenkins X team and we've talked about with some of the other contributors is handling webhooks from GitHub, for example. If you set up an instance inside your organization or inside your home network, unless you expose your Jenkins to the public internet, you have no way of receiving webhooks from GitHub. And because Jenkins Evergreen is this sort of connected instance that's always receiving updates and information from the Jenkins project, we actually have a communication channel to where we can provide webhooks to that Jenkins Evergreen instance in a way that the Jenkins project currently cannot support with our existing infrastructure. And implementing some of those features just to make it that much easier to use Jenkins through Evergreen are some of the things that we've talked about doing. But we also want to move Jenkins Evergreen out to more platforms. Right now, we're configuring everything sort of by default out of the box for Docker, and we've started the support for an AWS flavor, which means you would be able to go to Jenkins.io and click a Launch on AWS button, and we would deploy the CloudFormation template in your AWS environment that sets up the right S3 buckets, the right ECS configuration, the right agent configuration in Jenkins to take advantage of either ECS or EC2 to run your workloads natively on AWS. And this is where the convergence of some of the features that we have, or the superpowers, as Kosuke talked about yesterday, gets to be really, really interesting. If we know that you're deploying on AWS and Carlos and Oleg and Jesse and the other members of the Cloud Native SIG are implementing this great functionality that brings Jenkins closer to AWS native components and APIs. For Evergreen on AWS, when those features are made available, we can turn them on and we can ship those out to users that are already running on AWS. And that's really a really exciting part of the evolution of Evergreen as we move forward. I keep forgetting just to go past the title slide. And for AWS, I think there's a lot of powerful things that we can do by default. Or the other thing that we've started to talk about is shipping a Helm chart that just ships Evergreen on Kubernetes with all of the right things for Kubernetes set up by default. And that means configuring Jenkins to know how to talk to Kubernetes by default, configuring Jenkins to use agents on Kubernetes by default, and just using what we have on that platform in an intelligent way that we've never been able to before in the Jenkins project without someone knowing to go download a plugin, configure it with these toggles, and then get going with that. Because we know what platform we're going into, we can start to add features that are available to everybody else, but they have to know how to get them into Evergreen by default, which is really exciting. And so, as I mentioned, we're in that early adopter phase. Getting involved now is probably going to be the most beneficial, the most impactful if anybody wants to get started or see Jenkins be delivered more continuously, Jenkins become, honestly, in my opinion, the Jenkins that it can be. I think Evergreen is the vehicle that we have to do that. And so we've got the Docker containers are published on the Jenkins IO site. There's some documentation on how to get started. You can join our chat with us there. I was chatting with Joe, I hope you don't mind me calling you out again, about some of the AWS support. There's other environments that I don't even think about right now, or I'm not going to focus on. But if you're passionate about Google Cloud, we haven't thought about what Jenkins Evergreen and what the right Jenkins distribution looks like for Google Cloud. Or Jenkins Evergreen for OpenStack, or OpenShift, or all of these different platforms that people are deploying their infrastructure on. There's a path forward for us with the Evergreen model and the backend and how we've defined this to add additional flavors to allow us to say, for OpenShift, here's the most integrated, well-defined, exciting version of Jenkins and all of the plugins that are automatically configured. Just click this button, or just run this OC command, or just do something like that. And that's something where I think if you work with a different platform that's not Docker or AWS, that's where we could really use your help and your input. And then finally, the set of plugins that we're including in this sort of base level of features that we have right now is intentionally bare bones. And so there may be some plugins that you're very passionate about using or that are critical to your environment that could be beneficial for everybody that's using Jenkins Evergreen. And that's something that I think you can also help us define, is what is, I don't want to say perfect, but what is the best version of Jenkins? Or what is the best set of things that Jenkins has to have in order to make it useful for everybody as they get started or as they continue to grow in a project or in their organization? And that's something that you can, regardless of your experience level with Jenkins or regardless of how, I would say, involved you want to get with the Jenkins project, that feedback is really useful at this point in time because we can sort of define what this looks like for Jenkins Evergreen users as we move forward. Oh, hey, there's a lunch on my calendar that I have to go to. So thank you for listening. I wanted to leave a good amount of time to answer any questions about this as possible because I know in the keynote there wasn't a lot of opportunity to define more of what Evergreen is. So thank you for listening, and please ask me questions. I can't see anybody, so you'll have to just shout it. So that'll be Baptiste Mathis. He'll be speaking at 3:45 in the room adjacent to this one, Golden Gate Ballroom A, I think that is.
When's your expected release date?
It's live right now.
But you said you wouldn't use it in production.
So,
Live, but not use it in production.
right. So for me, the bar is how would I want to use this within the Jenkins project, for example? Because we have a couple of Jenkins instances that are running around that we manage manually. And the threshold for me is we've got to run through this exercise of getting more familiar as developers within the project at shipping these updates and receiving telemetry. And once we feel comfortable with that, I mean, we're shipping plugins that you're already using. So the raw materials are all the same as what people are deploying in production right now. For me, the line is, at what point do I feel confident that the information that we're providing to the Jenkins project is being valued by the plugin maintainers and core maintainers and influencing how we can update and how we can fix issues or implement new features. To me, that's sort of the line for when I would say this is ready for production. Excuse me?
2 months? 3 months?
I have no idea. Some number of days greater than one. Done here?
So I have a question regarding the auto update.
Auto update, okay.
So usually the issues happen when I run the job.
Right.
For example, I use a step stage, but in new version of pipeline it has been sitting there something else. But I probably run that job after 2 days after you update.
Right.
How do you identify or roll back?
So the question is about, I don't really know when my instance is, safely updated until some pipelines have executed already that indicate that things are working correctly. So right now, our health checking is, for lack of a better description, fairly primitive. So we don't have synthetic transactions or anything that's running through Jenkins when it upgrades to say, this pipeline always has to run, or we expect this pipeline to always run. I've had some really interesting conversations over the past couple days about what the right user experience would be to define, here's the n number of pipelines that I expect will always complete and will always be running. They're mission critical for my instance. How we would allow you to define, don't just run the health checks, but also trigger these pipelines. And if those are okay, then yes, it was a successful update. So we don't have that support right now. But that's something that I fully agree, like in a lot of cases, you have to actually run through some pipelines before you're absolutely confident that it's working correctly. Sorry, let me come back to you.
So does it work for the master agents? How does it work for the master agents when you upgrade? So right now, the manual processes, I have to go and upgrade all the masters, agents, make sure all the files are updated.
Right.
Does it improve using Evergreen, not going to each and every?
So the question is largely about, how does the upgrades of the master relate to the upgrades of software that needs to be upgraded on agents? As it stands right now, we're auto-configuring ephemeral agents out of the box. And part of the reason that we started with that as a default is it does avoid that issue. We don't have, I would say, any plans right now to support auto-updating of agents that have been, long-lived agents that have been connected. It's a very, very interesting problem, and it's a very interesting challenge to where I'd love to talk more about this after lunch in the contributor booth, in the Jenkins project booth. I'd be really interested to talk about how you've been managing this thus far and see what we could maybe figure out to solve this with Evergreen.
It's a huge challenge because
Right.
we have maybe like 20
Yeah.
or 30
Yeah. There's some organizations that I've seen that have a lot of long-lived manually provisioned agents, and right now we haven't been able to focus on what that problem statement would look like for Evergreen. There's a sort of middle. Yes.
Is it only cloud-based plugins, or are you working on like Maven or SonarQube plugins also?
So I work at CloudBees. This is a complicated relationship. You ask if it's only CloudBees plugins or other things like SonarQube. This is all Jenkins project-related stuff. This has nothing to do really with CloudBees. As far as I'm concerned, if there are other plugins in the Jenkins project that are really, really valuable, and there's some that don't have a maintainer who's currently employed by CloudBees, those I have no problem including if they're valuable enough to the Jenkins Evergreen user base. The challenge that we're going to have as a project as we go forward is there are a number of plugins which are important but don't have either active maintainers or don't have really engaged maintainers. And you may have seen my colleague Mark Waite at the little Updata plugin corner out here. There's some plugins like the EC2 agent plugin that don't have a very active maintainer right now. And when we look at the Evergreen model, we have this sort of chicken and egg problem. Like we want that EC2 plugin to be incorporated. It provides a really useful feature to Evergreen users. But if we see problems with that, we don't know who to talk to. And so for me, the sort of rule of thumb that I've been applying to plugins that we're including in the Evergreen distribution by default is they have to be really, really useful and obviously useful for end users. And there has to be at least some person I can reach out to if we see problems from Evergreen users with that plugin. So SonarQube is actually very well maintained. That's a really good one. I've had a couple of people ask me about that already. That is probably worth including in that distribution. So if it's in the Jenkins project right now, as far as I'm concerned, it has to meet a couple of those criteria, and we can ship it. So I'll come back to you at another question over here.
So I just have another question on the upgrade.
Okay.
Can we get it as a zero downtime upgrade, or do you expect that to take this restarts, or there is a downtime for every upgrade?
So the question was about having a zero downtime upgrade with Evergreen. So in the Docker flavor as it stands right now, we can't do that. It's not entirely possible. When we explore what Jenkins Evergreen plus Kubernetes looks like, or whether we're looking at how we're going to work with Jenkins X and bring those things together, that because we have Kubernetes under the hood there, then zero downtime upgrades becomes a very real possibility. But with the normal Docker flavor as it stands right now, we don't have that support from the underlying infrastructure that Kubernetes provides that would make that actually a very real possibility. Sorry, let me just double check over here. There's been lights right in my eyes, so I may have been missing people. I'll go to the front. I'll come back to you, though.
So you said automatic update, right?
Automatic update, yes, sir.
But it's possible there's some IT control that when to do that, or basically go through the list. Which list should be updated?
So the question is about, can we control that from the IT organization and when those automatic updates are being applied inside of our organization? I've had a lot of people actually ask me about that this week. Right now, there's not support for that. There's some really interesting discussions I've had thus far this week on how we would enable that. But as it stands right now, it's not present. But it is certainly something that I think enough people have asked about to where we're going to have to figure out a good path forward for an organization. And so just going one row back, you had a question?
So do you have an architecture diagram of how the Evergreen is set up, where the master is running and the agents and how the whole configuration is done?
So asking if we have an architecture diagram for how the master and agents and all of these things are set up, we don't right now. I know that in Baptiste's talk at 3:45, he has some slides that talk about how the system works and boxes and arrows. But in terms of when you deploy an Evergreen environment, what that architecture looks like, I don't have any material on the Jenkins IO site right now that would describe that. That's something I think we can add. So going back into the light. One of you shout. I can't. So yes, if you could switch back to, I'd say, classic Jenkins from Jenkins Evergreen, I can think of ways to do that. If you go through the instructions that we have on Jenkins IO, what you'll be doing is you'll be creating a volume that's for the Jenkins home directory where Jenkins is going to store data. You can take that and use that with a normal Jenkins.war. There's a risk that's involved there in that some plugins that we have which are later or more recently released might be, they might have performed a data migration that would not be compatible with an older version of that plugin. So it's certainly possible. But, sorry? Sorry, yeah, we can actually, I should have showed you that. So, like, we can go to, the classic interface is still there in Jenkins Evergreen. So like this is, if my network was working, this is just the classic interface, and it's all still there. We haven't removed that part, but we've defaulted to the Blue Ocean interface because we believe it provides a better user experience for new people coming in. So the left. So comparing and contrasting Evergreen with configuration as code, we're certainly using it right now under the hood. All the automatically applied defaults and how we configure things, we're actually using configuration as code. So if you go to the Jenkins, the Evergreen GitHub repository, you can actually look at how we're configuring those Jenkins Evergreen instances with our own YAML that we're using for configuration as code. So I'm a huge fan of the work that Nicola and Evelina have been doing, so I strongly recommend using configuration as code. So down in front, you had a question?
A comment, and I'd love to hear you.
I will only take questions. So if you have a question.
Okay, then my question, I'll form it as a question.
Nope.
Why did they call it Evergreen and something like Jenkins Appliance? Because I think we're going to miss a lot of people who really need this when they see the word Evergreen. They don't know what that is.
So the reason for Evergreen as the name, I mean, when we talk about getting a distribution in AWS, we'll probably have the Jenkins Quick Start, as Joe and I were chatting about before. Evergreen as a name is, that name I've seen used at other organizations, and I think it very aptly applies for an automatically updating distribution system, and that's why we chose the name Evergreen. And it's cute, I like it. Sorry, was there another question over there? Yeah. Asking if we're using canary releases on the update. So we don't have this support implemented right now, but the infrastructure is actually in place to allow us to have different update channels. And so similar to how the Google Play Store works or how Chrome is delivered, we have all of the infrastructural support to allow us to say, we've talked about having a canary release channel for Evergreen, a beta release channel for Evergreen, and general. And Canary would be something we would be running on all of our instances, and wild and crazy users could try out. And then we would progress through those channels similar to how Chrome is released right now. So the support is all there. We haven't implemented the actual different channels and how you would select when you launch Evergreen, how to choose one or the other. But yeah, it's a great idea, and I have no shame stealing it from Chrome. Are there any other questions? Because it's lunchtime. No? All right, so I'll be at the Jenkins project booth the rest of the day, and Baptiste will be speaking at 3:45. Thank you for listening.